So welcome to this webinar on exporting textiles to the Swedish and the EU market with a particular focus on sustainability. My name is Linda Rydén and I'm a trade advisor at the Open Trade Gate Sweden. For 1 hour, I, together with a very welcome guest speaker from Kappahl that we have here today, we will be talking about the Swedish market for textiles and what it takes to enter this market. So this is briefly the agenda for today. I will start by presenting Open Trade Gate Sweden, so us who organize this session and what type of support you can get from us. Then we'll get into the Swedish market for textiles specifically, so that you get an idea of what the market looks like. And we will then look at some of the major trends and shifts that are transforming the market and that you need to be aware of if you want to export to this market, or if you're supporting companies that do. After that, we'll hear from Eva Kindgren de Boer, that I mentioned, who is managing sustainability projects at Kappahl, which is one of the major fashion companies in Sweden, active in both men's, women's, and children's wear. So we'll try to make time for questions at the end. And just a reminder, leave them in the chat or in the Q&A box if you feel that there's something you want me to address. So firstly, Open Trade Gate Sweden. We're part of the National Board of Trade in Sweden, which is a government agency that works with trade policy and the EU internal market, among other things. So this picture shows the different segments that we're active in, and Open Trade Gate Sweden is a part of the Development Corporation here at the bottom. Our overall goal is to increase the knowledge and capacity of exporters to be able to access the Swedish market and the EU market. And we're funded by Swedish Development Aid via the Ministry for Foreign Affairs. We provide services both directly to exporters and to export promotion organizations. And all of our services for these target groups are free of charge. And we work in two main ways. One as a point of contact and one with capacity building. So as a point of contact, we share information with exporters abroad and importers in Sweden. And to avoid exporters having to, for example, reach out to several government agencies and experts to get ready for market entry, our goal is to essentially make life a little bit easier for them. So the aim of our point of contact is to be a one-stop shop for exporters from developing countries. So we provide information on things like legal requirements, private standards, but also on market trends and market characteristics. And our main contact channel with you and all exporters and importers working with trade going from developing countries to Sweden and the EU is actually our website. We mainly have a lot of information available in English, aimed directly at exporters and BSOs. The website contains general information about how we can help exporters find their way into the EU and Swedish market. And you can also find our contact info there if you have specific questions. We've also recently launched the road to export, that we call it, which is sort of a step-by-step approach to export. So if you don't really know where to start, I think that's something that's interesting to check out. And with that brief intro, we're going to get into what you really want to hear, the Swedish market for textiles. And for those of you who are really new to the market, I'm just going to give you a few basic facts about Sweden. So Sweden is a member of the European Union since 1995, and we don't have the euro as our currency. We have the Swedish crown. Sweden is a fairly big country geographically, but with a rather small population in terms of the size of the country. The Swedish population is about 10 million people, and it's growing steadily. Most Swedes live in the south of the country, where the climate is a little bit milder, still cold because it's the north, but it's a little bit milder, and there's better connectivity to mainland Europe as well. And around 86% of Swedes live in cities. This is actually true for all Nordic countries. So Sweden, as well as our neighbors, we have quite high taxes as a share of GDP. And the relatively high income and corporate taxes pay for a large public sector, so like healthcare and free education, among other things, are what they pay for. And what's very interesting when it comes to trade is that around 40% of the Swedish GDP comes from exports. So much of the economic activity is actually based on exporting. And perhaps even more relevant for you in the audience is that around 30% of those exports depend on imports of the value of those exports. So this is really high actually in international comparison. And this is why imports are really important to us, and also why Sweden is a country that's open to trade. Looking more specifically at the Swedish consumer, Swedes are big consumers of textiles. So what you see here is on average that a Swedish consumer buys 14 kilos of textiles every year. 10 of those are clothes and shoes, and the remaining 4 are home textiles. We've also seen a net inflow, so imports minus exports, that's gone up 30% since 2000, in the last 20 plus years. And out of these 14 kilos, a bit more worryingly perhaps, we throw away around 8, and almost none of that can be recycled today. So that's caused a spotlight to land on the textiles industry as one of the major sources of waste and pollution. A little bit later on in the presentation, I will try to describe what this may mean in terms of consumer trends and the pressure on the industry. So if we look at the trend over the last 20 years in textile imports to Sweden for apparel, this is textiles including shoes, so apparel and shoes, we see a long upward trend. So this is true for all categories of apparel that have been measured. So if we include shoes, the imported market value was around 7 billion euros in 2020. So the growth has been sustained over quite a long period of time, essentially up until the pandemic, where you see this slight negative kink to the right in the graph. But Sweden also has a large export, even in the, or also in the apparel sector, as you can see here. That's the yellow line. If you look at the fashion segment and specifically at clothes, H&M makes up most of the export, around 80% actually. H&M is a large global player, and only about 4% of their sales happen on the Swedish market. So naturally, even though all exports from H&M aren't registered to Sweden, a lot of the Swedish fashion exports are still from H&M. But as I will show you in the coming slides, much of the Swedish fashion export depends on these imports. Here you have a pie chart that shows you Sweden's biggest import countries when it comes to apparel. So first of all, Sweden doesn't have the right conditions, essentially, for large-scale manufacturing of textiles today. We used to have quite a lot of textile manufacturing, but it has shifted, as for most European countries, mainly to Asia. And today we don't really have the equipment or labor with the right skills or wage expectations or the climate to grow cotton. So when it comes to apparel, we import mainly from Asia, and in Asia, it's clearly dominated by China, but also Bangladesh. You see here that countries within Europe also play an important role, like Germany and Denmark, the Netherlands as well. So to a large extent, this is because they function as trade hubs, or because they have a small part of the production line. But most of the textiles that we import from other European countries have already been imported from another country in the first place outside the European Union. So they function as trade hubs. And you can also see that Poland takes a role here, and that's a market that has grown quite a bit in importance as a trade hub for the EU market in recent years. So why is this interesting for you? Well, in order to sell to a Swedish consumer, you may sometimes sell through an import agent or other company in a trade hub, where your goods can sometimes be distributed to many European markets. Since we're part of the European Union, once a good has entered the Union, it can basically circulate freely within the Union. So the picture I showed you before was for apparel, and this one is for home textiles. And when it comes to home textiles, the main exporters to Sweden are largely the same as for apparel, actually. One notable difference being that Pakistan is also very important to the Swedish market for home textiles. But I wanted to show you this picture just to set this in the perspective of Europe as a whole and stress the point about trade hubs. Because European home textiles market it's a strong and big market in Europe, and up until 2020 it was also growing, even though it was a little bit slower than the apparel sector. And in this graph, you can see that the share of trade in between European countries is large. That's represented by the blue bars. But you can also see that the share of developing countries as suppliers has been growing as well. So that's represented by the yellow bars. And Asian countries dominate, with China and Bangladesh again. But also countries geographically closer to Europe, like Turkey, Morocco, and Tunisia. They're also important suppliers. So despite a decrease in the pandemic year 2020, that was quite significant, still we saw more than 17 billion euros worth of home textiles imported into the EU. So it's quite a big market. So I'm now moving on to some of the more specific characteristics of the Swedish market. And one thing worth mentioning, if you want to understand the Swedish market, is also the extreme growth in online sales. It's something you see across Europe as a whole, but Sweden is at the top when it comes to, well, how large part of the population are shopping online. Last year, it's estimated that, don't worry, you don't need to read all these numbers. I just want to give you an idea. Last year, it's estimated that 216 million consumers in Europe bought something online from outside their own country. So this slide is just to show you that the growth has been strong in all textile segments, from furniture and home decoration to apparel to sports and leisure. And the conclusion that we can draw from this is that, well, if you're planning on selling to an end consumer, it will be really important to have an online presence. And that segment is expected to grow even further. But even if you're selling to companies or producing by order, it's still an important aspect of the market that's good for you to understand, and it will give you an idea of the type of consumer pressure that your customer or the company that's buying from you is facing. If we look at key players then on the Swedish market, who they are will depend on your segment. But I wanted to give you a few examples from the home textile sector, the clothing sector, and I'll also go into the leather sector. And I'm starting here with home textiles. Hemtex is the name of one of the absolutely most well-known home textile retailers in Sweden, not least when it comes to physical stores, with a lot of physical stores and also a strong online presence. IKEA is perhaps the most famous brand internationally, and a very large player in everything from curtains to carpets and everything in between. So fashion combined with home textiles is also common. You see a few examples here, like H&M Home, Indiska, and Åhléns, for example, a department store. They have segments or separate stores for home textiles and clothes. So another one is Ellos, which is large in online sales and in mail order as well. Part of the same group is Jotex, with a strong focus on interior design. Moving on to some key players in the fashion and clothing segments. It's impossible not to mention H&M. They actually have all of the brands in this little square here. COS in the more expensive segment, and other stories, upper mid-range, perhaps you could label it. They have Monkey for a younger audience, more low cost. H&M is also a majority owner of the Cheap Monday brand since about 20 years back. Other well-known retailers include Kappahl, that we're lucky to have with us today, Lindex, Gina Tricot, Marquette, which used to be called MQ, some of you might recognize. We also see outdoor and sportswear brands that are quite important in this market, most often with a clear sustainability niche. So we have Fjällräven that have been good at exporting as well. Klättermus and Didrikssons, Hestra are a few other examples. In the high fashion or niche brand segment, we see brands like Filippa K, focus on timeless classics. Our legacy, Acne Studios, Nudie Jeans are a few other examples. We also see other Nordic players playing an important role in the market. Varner includes brands like Dressman and Cubus. We have the Swedish group Retail and Brands with brands like Polan och Pyret for kids, the Brothers for men. And a few Danish brands are also sort of top of mind for the Swedish consumer. Like for underwear, we have Twilfit, for example, Vera Moda for women's apparel. So it can be worth looking into Nordic players because the bigger ones tend to have a presence in several Nordic markets. I sometimes receive questions from leather producers and exporters regarding the Swedish market for leather. And this is not really the main focus today, but I'll just give you a quick idea of some of the main characteristics of this market in Sweden. We actually have quite a well-established leather sector, not least because we have a lot of reindeer up in the north of the country, where that leather and fur and handicrafts from those are used. The Swedish leather sector can be divided into a low price and a high-end segment. And I think that's a useful way to think about it if you're considering exporting in this segment. So for the high-end segment, rigorous controls of certification and very high demands on the quality of the products is required. For the low-cost segments, we're looking at import of finished goods mainly. And it can be wallets or leather bags or belts or parts of these goods. Sweden also stands out a little bit in that it has several players in equestrian accessories, like horse saddles, for example. We also have tanneries here, some of which are importing leather hides of high quality. You'll find the tanneries or some of the tanneries under the blue line here, and you'll find above the blue line, you can see examples of some of the retailers and brands that are big in the leather segment. For example, Sandqvist, they make leather bags that are quite popular at the moment. PS of Sweden is one of those equestrian players that I was talking about. But then if you know the brands, do you know who to approach? Maybe not. It can sometimes be a more complex story, or very often be a more complex story. But for a textile supplier from a developing country, sourcing agents and distributors can play an important role. When targeting the Swedish market, this may involve working with the European distributor or an agent covering the Nordic market, for example. And the commission that these agents and distributors require, it can vary quite a lot, depending on things like how complex your product is, what's your reputation in the market, in your own market or in the European market that you're trying to access, how big are the order sizes, to how many countries do you want to reach, what's the network of the agent, things like that. It's also possible to market your own brand, of course, in any market, but it is really quite a niche in the market. It's not very common to be very successful in that unless you have a really unique idea or you're quite well established. You have that added difficulty of not having a local presence normally. But if you approach retailers or buyers directly, many actually have sourcing offices abroad. So you can check if there are sourcing offices in your region and think about whether it can be worth actually approaching them instead of the head office, for example. This tends to be a little bit more difficult if your country is less established as a textile producer. But I've mainly mentioned traditional retailers, but there's also plenty of e-commerce platforms that sell many brands. So you see a few examples here. I've listed a few in like different segments, but there are several. They can sometimes be a way into the market for new brands or as an alternative to establishing a physical presence. And one thing also that can be good to know if you're actively trying to map out and contact key players in the Swedish textile sector is that traditionally the Swedish manufacturing of textiles was focused around Borås in the western part of Sweden. And specifically, well, the manufacturing has mainly left the area, but the expertise in the sector is still focused around that area, both in terms of education programs, but also like where startups are initiated and where a lot of the innovation is happening. It's in that area. So if, for example, you're looking for independent designers, that can be an area to start searching. It can also be in Stockholm, the capital, where you see some established ones. And now we're getting to the part of the session that's a little bit more forward-looking. And I've given you some numbers now to estimate the size of the Swedish market and some names to research to see if they're interesting potential customers or just to get an idea of the market. But I also mentioned at the beginning this big transformation happening. So I'm going to go into that. So there are actually several reasons why the textile industry is changing. And one of them is the impact that the industry has on the environment. So we're facing climate change with droughts and floods as a result, leading to food shortages, extinction of species, among many other problems. And the textile sector is one where it's really quite difficult to produce the type of textiles that we use today in a way that's environmentally friendly. And that's also why people are starting to raise awareness of the environmental impact of the clothes and other textiles that we consume. In fact, it's been estimated that around 10% of the global CO2 emissions come from the textile sector. It's also very water intensive production, and a lot of chemicals need to be used for some steps in the production as well. And when using cotton, there are problems of land use and water use. And when using synthetic fibers, normally the dependency on fossil fuels is greater. So also both natural and synthetic fibers are also difficult to recycle. So that's one of the big problems as well for the industry, the difficulty to recycle textiles. And you who work in the sector are probably well aware of this. So a lot of the textile waste ends up in landfill, which in turn pollutes both land and water. And the second major challenge has to do with the workers' conditions and the traceability of supply chains, essentially. So this is something that the media in Sweden and many other countries as well have been reporting for a longer time, as perhaps it's easier to see the immediate problems compared to long-term climate change. But the textile industry has been reported to be one of a few sectors with a big problem of unsafe working conditions, reports of sexual harassment, unequal treatment in the workplace. So, for example, not letting workers join labor unions or not providing wages that the workers can support themselves on. And in some companies and locations, there have also been reported use of child labor. So these two challenges together, the environmental and social one, are really important for Swedish buyers. And in the coming slides, I will try to show you what that means and what you as an exporter or someone who supports exporters can do to think about this and to adapt to the new demands stemming from an increased awareness of sustainability challenges. But so then, what is actually happening in the market? So we're living in a really dynamic time when it comes to this industry, and there's a lot of pressure for change in the European textile market. And it's coming from three different directions, a simplified way of looking at it. But if we start from the consumer point of view, at the bottom of the slide, more and more consumers in European markets, and almost especially in Sweden and a few other markets that are especially aware of this and working actively with this, people are starting to care about sustainability aspects of what they buy. They want to know that what they buy has been produced in an ethical way, and they want to be able to trace it. So as a result, for example, sales of secondhand goods have increased a lot, and brands marketing themselves as sustainable are really gaining traction if they manage to create a believable story. From the legal perspective, you can expect new and stricter legislation for textiles in the EU market. The European lawmakers within the European Union, but also on national level, are working really hard to come up with ideas to try to fulfill the promises that they made. For example, the EU has promised to be climate neutral by 2050. And the textile sector is one of those that has been labeled one of the most important sectors to tackle. So there are currently suggestions on a number of areas, including, for example, a digital product passport, where you should be able to trace the product throughout the entire value chain. And there are suggestions to further limit the use of chemicals. There are also suggestions to make the seller of textiles responsible for the waste. And that's already happening, actually. So just to sum it up, you can expect that in the medium term, there will be higher demands on traceability. And that means both knowing where the goods come from, but also what impact they have in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, labor conditions, water use, chemical use. So this will be a really big challenge for the industry, and it's not really clear exactly what the demands are going to look like. But there are proposals for new legislation, as I said, in a range of fields. And we will also try to, when we know very concretely what's going to happen and how it will affect exporters, we will also try and update you via our website. From the industry perspective then, finally, companies are competing with each other on introducing new sustainability initiatives, like new innovative recycled materials, for example, introducing secondhand shopping, or collecting textiles themselves. So this is also putting pressure on other companies to follow along, not to lose out to their competitors. And as producers, this essentially means that you will have a competitive edge if you're able to offer clearly more sustainable goods to your potential buyers, as it's something they are experiencing, well, both legal requirements, but also consumer demands for. And in the coming slides, I will just introduce some business models that are gaining attention right now to give you some inspiration and an idea of what this could look like. And the first one I want to mention is reuse, and it's, well, simplified about designing the products to have a long lifetime with many uses, and possibly also with many different people using them. It can be about making a product more flexible by designing it in modules, for example, so you can, well, the product can grow and change with its owner. Or another example is these videos from Fjällräven, the outdoor brand that I mentioned before, on how to repair your products when they're broken. Instead of promoting buying a new one, for example, they can, for example, sell repair kits or spare parts, and they can also communicate in this way that the products are supposed to last a very long time. I mentioned secondhand shopping and that it's been growing. So that's also an example of the reuse business model, creating both creating and answering to an increased demand. So civil society organizations like the Red Cross have been doing this for a really long time, and they're expanding their business in this area as well, because they see that it's effective and that the demand is really growing quickly. But we also see dedicated for-profit stores selling secondhand goods in Sweden, and very successfully so in many cases. We have Sellpy, Arkivet, the auction site Tradera, for example, are a few of the ones worth mentioning. We also see that the traditional fashion brands, especially, are entering the secondhand segment, like H&M recently launched a web store focusing on secondhand, and a few others as well. Another up-and-coming, more sustainable business model is remake. So this is where old textiles are used to create new ones. As textile waste is hard to recycle, this business model instead views this as a resource and actually uses it. So it's about creating new textile products from old ones without breaking them down to new fibers first. So it can be upcycling, like just decorating or bettering a product, or it could be totally remaking it into a different textile product. And some Swedish examples that are working in this way are Remake Stockholm and Raid Review, for example. Worth mentioning in this context is also that the legal requirements for marketing old textiles that you may not even know what they contain can be a little bit of a challenge to navigate, as you will still be responsible for the contents of your product, making sure there are no harmful chemicals and things like that in the product that you sell, even if you didn't produce the original pieces of it. So, but in some of the suggestions on how the EU can improve circularity in the industry, there are recommendations actually, which to make it easier to import and sell recycled materials. And that speaks for a bit of a brighter future, I would say, for the remake segment. The third business model I'm going to mention is recycling, and of course connected to that, to use the recycled materials for new products. There are quite a few examples of using, for example, old PET bottles for making that into new materials and garments, especially. But what I'm talking about here is textile to textile. We have both mechanical and chemical recycling that's possible, but the mechanical one is much more common. And the problem with that technique is it's really difficult to sort the textiles. Often many different materials are used in the same product, and it's hard to tell how a product has been produced. It's also really difficult to work with quality assurance of the product that you end up with. But Sweden has actually been a bit of a pioneer when it comes to structured industrial scale sorting of textile waste, and has invested quite a lot in a test facility called Siptex for this. So today we see that the recycled product can mainly be used for very basic products and in downcycled form in industry, like for isolation, for example. But there are a few cases like, for example, Renewcell and Swedish stockings that use solely recycled textiles to create new garments and tights. To make sure that you're still awake and alert, it's time for a poll. The first question is, what region are you mainly working in? And what region are you representing today? Are you calling in from or working for North and Central America, Africa, Europe? Would be really, really interesting to know. The second question is, what statement describes you best? Are you exporting to Sweden today? You're not exporting to the EU, but would like to start, etc. And the third question that we have is on whether or not you're familiar with these sustainability-related certifications. And if you're aware of them, if you've heard of them, so feel free to click in your answers in the poll. see that around half of you have already answered. And we have people from all the regions except for Oceania right now. Really glad to see that. And we have people in the audience who are not exporting to the EU today, but would like to start. And someone who's already exporting to Sweden, but might like to increase that, or just listening in. And I can see that a lot of you are familiar with the sustainability related certification fair trade, and some of the others as well. Okay, I think we can end the poll. Thank you, Tilda. You can click share results, I think. Yeah, around 40% calling in from Africa, 20% from Asia, 20% from North and Central America, and just 7% to 13% from South America and Europe. So it's going to be really interesting for us to see whether there's a big difference here, looking at this or looking at the people who will actually watch the recording. I can see that I have been talking for a little bit too long. So instead of going through these certifications that I that I mentioned or that we saw in the poll, I will make sure that you get these slides and you will have some information on there. It's just these standards are some of the ones that have been mentioned to us in interviews with Swedish importers, and that's why we've lifted them especially. It will depend really a lot on who you're selling to, which certifications will be important to you. So it's not a general recommendation that these are the best ones. It's just that they are a little bit familiar to Swedish importers, and they cover some different aspects. So both social and environmental, but we don't really have the time to go through it. I can just mention this is one that's specifically for the Nordic markets. It's the Nordic Swan eco label, and it's one of the ones that you will probably not be familiar with if you're not already in the market. It's close to the requirement specifications for the EU eco label, but it's open for both Nordic countries and for countries outside the region. So we see companies and brands from China, Turkey, and India, for example, who also have this label if they're interested in this in the Nordic market, as it's quite known here. I can also just give you a recommendation to check out the ITC sustainability map if you're interested in learning more about certifications or trying to find out which certifications are right for you. It can give you an idea of what you're already compliant with, what standards are important for what markets, and also what you need to do to fulfill the standards that you're interested in. So with that said, I will definitely hand over the floor now to Eva, because I've already spoken for too long, so sorry about that. Eva Kindgren de Boer, who works as Sustainability Project Manager at the Kappahl head office. And we're really happy to have her with us to give an example of a Swedish company with a very much global value chain. And she will explain how they work with purchasing and the sustainability aspects that come along with that. So over to you, Eva.
Yeah, thank you very much, Linda. And thank you very much for being here. It's I can just confirm, I think, more or less everything you said. I think you did a very good description about Sweden textile. Just checking if you hear me.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much.
Yeah. So my name is Eva Kindgren de Boer, and I'm working for Kappahl. And you may take the next slide, please. Kappahl, we have our head office and warehouse in Mölndal, is outside Gothenburg. And that is the cluster near Borås, as Linda was talking about. We are fully owned by Mellby Guard, so we are a private-owned company. We produce and sell about 40 million products every year. And our turnover this year is 4.7 billion Swedish kronor. And we have fashion for kids, women, and men, and in an average price that sort of the middle of the man can afford. Next, please. Our history started 1953, so next year we will be 70 years old company. It started with a man, Per-Olof Ahl, that had a mission that everyone should be able to afford attractive fashion to a good price. And we have more or less kept that mission still at Kappahl, that everyone here should be able to buy our goods and also be quite sure that we take care of the sustainability, that when you buy clothes in Kappahl, they should be, for example, free of hazardous chemicals. That is mostly the big issues for our customer. So we're taking care of that, and we have high goals to do that. Next one, please. So Kappahl, we say that we exist to celebrate diversity in everyday life. So we hope that our garment sort of is suitable for most all the people in everyday life, both sort of for going to school, to work, and for parties. And we want the fashion to be inclusive, human, courageous, and joyful. That is our four lead words that we're using in the office daily. Please, next one. So this is a picture from our office. It's we design all our clothes ourselves, and we buy all our orders from the head office in Mölndal. So we work very little with agents. So we buy directly from factories. Next one. And here you can see how we are spread. We have shops in Sweden, Finland, Norway, Poland, and England. And we have shops that are called Kappahl, and also we have shops that are called Newbie. Newbie is a range for small children, and it's doing extremely well and extremely important in sustainability. Here, for example, we just have got certificated cotton. And we have production offices. We are normally used to say that we are so big, so we have offices in the countries that we mostly produce in. So that is a big benefit for us, sort of to have the partnership with the supplier, to be able to see them quite often, visit them factory and so on. So we have 2 offices in China, 1 in Bangladesh, 2 in India, and 2 in Turkey. So they are our sort of right hand to our supplier. So today we are 369 stores and approximately 4,000 colleagues I have. Next one, please. Here is just a picture about how our shops could look like. It's sort of our main Kappahl and Newbie. And also, as Linda said, the growth of e-commerce has grown a lot during the pandemic. But at the same time, we can also see that it's slowing down a little bit now when Sweden has been opened, and you can now come to our shops and do the shopping yourself and look at and try the garments in our shops. Please, next one. When we work with our supplier, we have 2 documents that are sort of the key for a relationship. It's the general terms. It's sort of where we state all our terms and conditions, and also sustainable commitment. That is quite new one. It's taking care of our code of conduct, animal welfare, and that sort of thing. But it's also describe where we are today and where we are heading in the future. Where would Kappahl be when it's 2030? And when we have put up our goals where we want to be in 2030, it's extremely important that our supplier would like to follow us on that road. So we have sent out this sustainable commitment to all our suppliers to sign, so they also understand where we are heading in the future. And we have set goals that is in line with the Paris goals and also all the new legislation that is coming on, as Linda also talked about. So next one, please. Here is just a picture to show how we are thinking when we put up our goals. We are working, of course, with the UN Sustainable Development Goals, and then we have involved them in our different focus and commitment. So we have a lot of commitment that is belonging to the focus area. And I can take one as, for example, when we're talking about the different certification, that we are planned, for the moment, 100% of our cotton is from sustainable or more sustainable, either from BCI cotton or organic cotton certificated by GOTS. So we don't buy any ordinary cotton these days. As also Linda say, because it's also a huge water concerning, so it's very important that we try the whole way. Yeah. And also goals, of course, also have our shops, for example. So everyone has sustainable goals at Kappahl. We are a member of SAC, Sustainable Apparel Collection Coalition. This is an American membership that we have been a member of for 3 years. And they have different models, and they call them HIG Index, the total one. And as we are a member of SAC this year, we also want our supplier to be a member of HIG and to report in this way. So we are using, for example, for the sustainability, we are using their tool FEM, and for the social, we're using FSCI. So we are using all their tools, and we want our supplier to also be a member, and also sort of to validate their information by third part. So HIG is very important, and as we are a member of HIG, we also have to follow the HIG's status and also being better and better there. So HIG is important for us when we choose new supplier today. And I also can say, for example, H&M is also a member of HIG, and it's quite spread in Asia, where SAC and HIG is. Next one, please. I think in Sweden, we have worked with sustainability for quite a long time, even if we have a far way more to do. But we have understood that if we're going to work to reach our goals, we need to work with others. So we are working together a lot in Sweden, we brands, and I think that is very strange. There's not many brands in other countries that dare to work as much together as we do in Sweden. So if we, for example, take the Swedish Textiles Initiative for Climate Action, it's more than 50 brands in that membership that works together. We are putting the same goal for ourselves and for our supplier. And one also I can take, for example, BCI is also making the global cotton better, to grow that in a better way. So I think we are, when it's come to sustainability, is getting more and more important for us. But of course, when we choose a new supplier, we're also talking a lot about the prices, quality, lead time, and that sort of thing. So, but today it was sustainability that was on the issue. So I talk a little bit more about that. And also that is my give it. So that was my slide, Linda.
Thank you so much. It's really interesting to see the work you're doing and what it can mean for producers and the requirements that we actually have here on the market if you want to sell to some of the bigger players. Can I just ask you if it's possible to sum that up? What are the most important qualities that you see for Kappahl in a supplier and in a business partner?
I think when we start a new partnership, because we would like to see our supplier as a partnership that is a long-term partnership, that is not sort of a business for one season, is something that's going to keep for a long time. And we think that we are very transparent and open, so it's also very important that they can be transparent, they are willing sort of to show the factory we are welcome, and that we have a sort of an open communication.
And so also what I'm hearing is a little bit like flexibility towards new demands as well, perhaps.
Absolutely. That, of course, they have sort of, as I said, we have put up targets, and of course they have to follow that road to 2030. I think in Sweden we have come quite a lot with sustainability, and if you're in a part of any sort of memberships, I think maybe 50% of all the members are from Sweden. So we are working a lot with sustainability. So that is extremely important, of course. And it is extremely important for our planet that we work with sustainability. So they have to join that journey with us.
Yeah. And how important is, this is a very practical question, but how important is language skills, that you have someone who speaks good English, or is that normally handled via a local partner?
I think most of the business we are doing in English, but when we have meeting, for example, we provide tolk.
Oh yeah, an interpreter.
Yes, please. Yeah. So we have that, for example, it come to Turkey and to China, maybe we need that. But normally we don't see any problem with that. And I think we all speak this Swinglish, a mix of Swedish and English together. And we are not sort of, we're not saying we are the best in English. So we all help together.
Yeah, it all needs to just make sense for everyone. Yeah. That's how I feel too. Okay, no, that sounds great. And we're almost running out of time, unfortunately, because I was speaking a lot, but I will just quickly check. But I think we don't have any questions in. So if you have questions, then feel free to send us an email afterwards. And I will just leave you with a few last remarks on what kind of assistance you can get and how to prepare for market entry. So thank you so much, Eva, and I'll be back this afternoon.
And of course, if you get any question from my side, you're welcome to come back to me.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate that. And yes, for you in the audience as well, feel free to send us an email, and we'll get you in touch with Eva or ask her for you. When I spoke about what we can do from Open Trade Guide Sweden for you, I mentioned that we've launched a new tool called Road to Export. So I just wanted to point out sort of what that is. And that's a step-by-step approach to learning sort of, or improving the way that you reach out to new markets and that you start or expand your export business. It has a lot of links and information and tips and tricks on how to find the information that you need to be able to make relevant choices for what you do and what markets you choose. And you'll find that on our website, and I'll send you the link afterwards. It also has some tips and tricks on how to find a buyer and how to approach them, not least. We don't have time to look at legal requirements. I just wanted to list a few of the most important ones. If you're considering the European market, or the Swedish market for that matter, specifically, then you need to think about how close are you to complying with the rules of the EU market, because it is for good and bad in some ways, it is a very strictly regulated market to get into. So that's worth knowing. Many of you listening in will probably have access actually to trade agreements that will give you quite beneficial conditions or beneficial terms for exporting to the EU. So make sure that you look, is your country connected to GSP Plus, GSP, EBA? These are some of the agreements that can give you, for example, customs-free access to the European market if you provide a rules of origin certificate. So I'm out of time. I'm going to leave you with this useful information sources, and we're sending out all of the information and all of the presentation pack to you after this session.